Lecture 19, we call it Latin America. If you want to sort of think of a theme to go along with this lecture, think of the long 19th century and the big issues that we discussed in our lecture of last week. So what are we going to be talking about here? Latin America in the context of the long 19th century, the world economy, Western military dominance by this time, nationalism, modernization, ideas that we've talked about recently. How do these broader patterns work in Latin America? Latin America characterized. Is it the world's newest civilization? The economy is dependent on Western Europe through Spain and Portugal, at least of course in the beginning. A long colonial period that will end in the 19th century and parts of it in the 20th century. A long tradition of what we call landlord power, local power bases of large landowners who collect rent over their tenants. How to establish powerful central governments in regions ruled locally by powerful agricultural or industrial interest. These are some of the themes and long-running historical ideas that we can apply to Latin America. Latin America in the colonial period, well, it exports raw materials to the core. So Latin America was then, and even remains today in part, part of the periphery, responding to the core's interest. Latin America imports manufactured goods from Europe and elsewhere. It imports artistic and agricultural forms, primarily from its colonizers, the great imperial powers in Europe. Of course, Catholicism is a key feature of Latin American culture, also imported from Europe. Veneration of local deities transformed into saints. Here again we see syncretism, a key term we've talked about before, whereby local traditions are blended with a world religion to create something unique for that particular culture. And of course, in the colonial period, many illegitimate children are fathered by the European colonizer. Wars of independence, 1810, 1820. This period, of course, whereby Spain, the mother country, is weakened by the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. The Spanish colonies in the Americas take advantage of this diminishment of Spanish power. New states seek to curb or to co-opt the power of the Catholic Church. And of course, this is a very tricky proposition. You either get the church on your side to legitimize your power, or you try to diminish the power of the church. Very tricky proposition because the vast majority of the people may hold the church's legitimacy much higher than your own. Latin American leadership class confined to the Creole, this is the mixture, those of mixed blood, especially European blood, as opposed to the indigenous people. You don't see indigenous people rise to the top of these societies. Wars of independence did not overturn the basic ruling classes of the church, the landlord class, and then the military that's organized to protect these interests. New nations in Latin America. Well, the colonial period will end. Now how to form a state afterwards. Economic hardship follows independence. Political difficulties arise over legitimate rule, like we just talked about. The territorial integrity of these new states is open to question. Border wars will ensue as these new states try to establish themselves. Conservatives tend to defend landlords and the church. More liberal elements tend to fight for reform, labor reform and otherwise. And then of course you have dictators, dictatorial power arising in Latin America. Of course the U.S. has similar problems with slavery. That will not be resolved until 1865. So Latin America doesn't exist in isolation. Latin American culture, of course, is directly impacted by Europeans, the colonizers, Latin American cities look like European cities. Latin American elites travel to Europe to soak up these Western cultures, which they take back with them. Indigenous styles are often blend with Western styles. The Latin American economy, again, a peripheral region of the world. It's sort of locked into a production of exports, raw materials, food, precious metals, silver, coffee, copper. Large multinational corporations organize local economies in South America. Cheap labor, natural resources are exploited by the core nations, the great industrial powers. How to escape peripheral status? How to industrialize? Machinery and factories cost money. Where will the foreign currency come from to purchase machinery and expertise from the core? Latin American nations will borrow money from the core. This establishes a cycle of indebtedness, which in the end makes things worse. More exports are required to pay back the loans. And of course, the more you produce, the lower the price of these commodities. So you're caught in a vicious cycle here. Let's draw some conclusions. Latin American development demonstrates the variety of development across the globe. Latin America, a Western civilization. Socially and economically, Latin America doesn't look particularly Western because of its peripheral status. The power of the Catholic Church is obviously a Western feature. I'm going to quote here from McNeill's book again, The Human Web. He says, quote, the independent states of Latin America after 1826 usually adopted republican institutions, although Brazil styled itself an empire until 1889. But often as not, they were run by their armies because in most cases the army, and in some cases the church, was the chief institution that survived and prospered during the wars of independence. It was not until about 1950 that the principle of representative government became so generally accepted that almost every state at least pretended to adhere to it. Yet more of its history, and even today much of Latin America, remains in the periphery, a distinctly non-Western status. So this is a very tricky proposition here. Latin America, geographically, of course, is in the West. It's part of the sort of American system. Economically, it's much less Western, isn't it? Because of its more peripheral status in the sense that it exports raw materials, food, various commodities to the core. The core then fashion these things into finished products, which are then sold back. The long-standing sort of cycle of indebtedness also makes Latin America less Western. The Catholic Church, of course, makes it very Western. So Latin America is a very complex issue with regard to these themes in world history. So we'll stop there. Thank you.